I'm Emily Hawthorne, a Middle East and North Africa analyst at Stratfor, and this podcast is brought to you by Stratfor Worldview, our premier digital publication for objective geopolitical intelligence and analyses. Individual, team, and enterprise memberships are available at worldview.stratfor.com/subscribe.
I was afraid, more than once, meeting the KGB in the bowels of Moscow. Those are terrifying moments because those are terrifying people.
Welcome to the Stratfor podcast, focused on geopolitics and world affairs from Stratfor.com. I'm your host, Ben Sheen. Thanks for listening. What happened to CIA branch chief Freddie Woodruff? Yes, he was shot. Yes, a young man in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia was convicted for his murder, but what really happened? In this episode of the Stratfor podcast, Chief Security Officer Fred Burton speaks with Michael Pullara, author of The Spy Who Was Left Behind. String by string, Pullara unravels a mystery involving a murder, a conviction, and ultimately, an international conspiracy to cover up.
Hi, my name is Fred Burton, and I'm here today with Michael Pullara. And Michael has written a great book called The Spy Who Was Left Behind. The story is about the 1993 murder of a CIA officer by the name of Freddie Woodruff. Michael, thank you for joining the Stratfor podcast today.
It is a pleasure. I've been looking forward to this.
Tell me how you went about putting this story together and why.
The story is a recounting of my representation of the Woodruff family survivors in their effort to get the young man convicted of killing Freddie out of prison because he was innocent. I had discovered the fact of Freddie's death while reading the New York Times one morning at breakfast. I recognized his name because Freddie was someone with whom I had grown up in Searcy, Arkansas. He had come to Searcy to go to Harding College, where I was in the affiliate elementary school at the time he arrived. And I ended up going to school with his sisters and sitting in Bible class with his father. So when I read that Freddie had been murdered in Tbilisi, Georgia, while riding in the backseat of a car driven by the head of personal protection for Eduard Shevardnadze, I became interested. And I thought it might be nice to give the family a little bit of information in the form of facts and details about Freddie's demise to help them process and deal with his death. And when I began that investigation, it very quickly became apparent to me that the young man who had been convicted of that crime did not commit it. It was impossible for him to have committed the crime. And when I presented this to the family, specifically to Freddie's oldest sister, Georgia, her response was, well, that's terrible. What are we going to do to set that young man free? And that began a multi-decade odyssey to get him out of jail.
Michael, that's an amazing story. And in the spirit of transparency for our listeners, I just want everyone to know that when I was a special agent with the State Department, our office looked into the murder of Freddie Woodruff in the Soviet Republic of Georgia. Although I did not deploy on the actual case, one of the agents that I worked alongside with did. So when I saw your book, obviously I had to read it. We also curiously protected Shevardnadze when he would travel to the United States, which is an interesting kind of nexus there, too, to connect that dot. But Michael, in putting this story together, how did you do your research?
It started with Freedom of Information requests that I made to various government agencies that were involved, the CIA, the FBI, the Department of State, the National Security Agency. The CIA gave me nothing. I sued them. I lost. I went to the Fifth Circuit. I lost. And this was the beginning of what proved to be persistent and consistent opposition to my goals. The FBI, however, was more forthcoming in their materials. It was badly boulderized and expurgated and censored, but I was able to make some sense out of the roughly 12 inches of documents that they sent me over the next decade. In addition, the Department of State provided me a whole series of documents, most important of which was a day-by-day summary of the trial of the young man who had been prosecuted. And so I was able, in large measure, to feel like I was actually sitting in the courtroom because the court did not have a contemporaneous record other than this one. When I completed the review of the materials, it was about 10 years after the murder when things had finally come through from my government. I got on an airplane and went to Georgia to sort of round out my investigation. The people in power at that time were still the same people who had put the young man in jail, so I didn't feel like I had anything that I could specifically do to obtain his freedom. But I did get to talk to some of the people involved in the investigation who were out of government. And one of them, the former head of the Information and Security Service, which was at that time essentially their FBI and CIA, he provided me an affidavit that in the presence of his deputies, the police had planted evidence for the FBI to find.
Wow. You know, I got to tell you, as a former agent who has lived in this world and conducted international investigations of assassinations and bombings and hijackings, I was going in with eyes wide open with full support at times of our own government. Were you ever scared in looking at this kind of case? Because you were kind of picking a band off a bad wound here.
Well, I was frightened either before or after particular events. But as you know, Fred, when you're in the midst of the fray, if your attention is not fully focused on what's happening at that moment, then you are at risk. And so while I was standing toe-to-toe with Mr. Saakashvili and his guards who had their guns trained on me, I was thinking only about Mr. Saakashvili. Afterwards, my stomach curdled and I was terrified. When I was confronting Eldar Gogoladze, trying to get him to confess that his testimony was false, I was focused entirely on him. But afterwards, when the FBI came to me and said, he's trying to kill you, you need to leave the country, I was afraid. And more than once, meeting the KGB in the bowels of Moscow, those are terrifying moments because those are terrifying people.
Well, without a doubt. I mean, in reality, you perhaps would never have made it out of that dungeon if they had chose to go down that path. That's Moscow rules. When you look back at this case, Michael, what do you think happened to Freddie?
I think that Freddie was placed in harm's way by people who were fixated on finding the mole inside the CIA. I think that in the mid-'80s, we suffered horrific losses in human intelligence sources and were desperate to find the source of those losses. The CIA and FBI together had already focused on and identified Aldrich Ames as the person who was responsible for at least a portion of those losses. And I believe that they made a troubling but defensible decision to allow Ames to continue operating and to continue traveling outside the United States, including to Georgia, to meet with Freddie and others in Tbilisi. He was there 3 weeks before Freddie was murdered. Aldrich Ames and Freddie had a social relationship and liked to drink together. And I believe that on one of those occasions, a specific day that I can identify, he and Freddie got drunk together, and after that, everything changed for Freddie Woodruff. And I believe that Ames disclosed himself, revealed something that caused Freddie, a highly trained intelligence officer, to realize that Ames was probably the spy that they were all looking for. Ames panics, contacts the KGB. The KGB sets in motion a plan to assassinate Freddie before he can return to Langley and report his findings. But the sad and frustrating part about it all was the agency already knew Ames was a traitor. They had already instituted proceedings against him through the Department of Justice. He just didn't know it yet. They were letting him run. They were playing the fish because they had other losses that could not be explained by Aldrich Ames alone. That led to one of the great ironies of this whole case, Fred. When the FBI finally started trying to trace the connection between Ames' treachery and Freddie Woodruff's assassination, they would go to the State Department and deal with the FBI liaison officer at the State Department to get country clearance in order to go to Georgia, in order to go to Russia, in order to go to Azerbaijan. And they would brief that officer on the status of their investigation of Aldrich Ames. Now, by this time, they knew that Aldrich Ames had been run by Victor Cherkashin. Cherkashin was an agent of extraordinary reputation inside the KGB. They briefed the liaison officer regarding the status of their investigation of Ames, and that liaison officer was Robert Hansen, another Cherkashin-run spy.
Wow. And of course, Hansen was the infamous traitor in the midst at the FBI who had access to all kinds of internal documents and records and so forth, which identified assets that were working for the U.S., predominantly Russian assets. So just the connecting the dots like you have done so well, Michael, in this story is simply amazing. And I think the tragedy here, we all know that this is a dirty business, and the great game of espionage, in many ways, people aren't supposed to be killed, but it does happen. So in essence, you see Freddie was pretty much executed by the KGB in order to protect a better placed asset, which was Aldrich Ames.
I had a meeting in Moscow with a KGB officer. I had several, but the one in particular. And he raised a very interesting possibility that Ames, who had been moved from Soviet counterintelligence into drug-related intelligence, had reached the end of his usefulness to the KGB.
Interesting.
And that the KGB executed Freddie not to save Ames, but to draw attention to Ames.
Interesting.
Thereby protecting another better-placed agent.
Which was Hansen inside the FBI.
Potentially, but the KGB didn't know who Hansen was. He was very careful to guard his identity from them, and so they did not know to what extent he might or might not be at risk. The suggestion from the KGB officer that I met with on that occasion was there was somebody who, absent a body that they could surrender to the CIA, might himself be found. And there are, of course, whispers of specific people that the agency and the Bureau were looking at that they stopped looking at because of Ames' arrest.
Pullara, author of The Spy Who Was Left Behind, in just one moment. Be sure to check out the links in our show notes. This book addresses a geopolitical game between the United States and the Soviet Union, and Stratfor Enterprise can help you keep up to date on rapid changes in the global environment. Our analyst team tracks developments and forecasts the long-term implications for organizations and individuals alike. With Stratfor Enterprise, businesses and teams can find out what's truly important right now and develop a more accurate view of the future. And this is backed up with detailed maps, charts, and graphs that help lay out political, economic, and security risk. And also, as part of the Enterprise package, you get access to our world-class analyst team. If you're not already a Stratfor member, you can an Enterprise subscriptions at worldview.stratfor.com/subscribe. Now, back to our conversation about the spy who was left behind. Thanks for joining us for this conversation.
And looking back at this case, I know from just doing my own books, Michael, there's always loose ends. There's always things that, still keep me up at night and kind of drive me crazy because I didn't figure it out. What didn't you figure out in this story?
I can tell you that you're absolutely right that there's a whole plethora of things that I didn't figure out. The one that I muse on the most is Eldar Gogoladze's employment history.
Who was he, Michael?
Eldar was the driver of the car that Freddie was riding in at the time of his assassination. Eldar was the head of personal protection for Eduard Shevardnadze. When Shevardnadze had been invited back to Georgia to take a position, the junior position, inside the ruling governing council, he contacted Jim Baker and asked the United States to provide his personal protection, the bodyguards. This became a CIA operation in which the CIA used Delta Force assets in order to train a bodyguard service around Shevardnadze and to stand up a small anti-terrorist squad that he alone could control. However, the head of that personal protection force was appointed not by Shevardnadze, but by another member of the governing council, a mafia chieftain named Jabba Yosseliani. Jabba chose Eldar Gogoladze. Now, according to my research and the statements of a whole bunch of different people, Gogoladze started out as a GRU asset inside the Soviet Union, and GRU placed him inside of KGB to spy on KGB. He then went to Georgian KGB when that country broke apart and moved up through the police department into the Interior Ministry, where Jabba Yosseliani tapped him to be the head of Shevardnadze's personal protection force. Now, as you well know, if I can control your personal protection, I can decide when you are going to be murdered. And so the Jabba Yosseliani was trying to control protection of our friend Shevardnadze. Freddie tried to recruit Eldar for the CIA. And inside the Georgian intelligence services, they referred to Eldar as the CIA agent.
Interesting.
But the truth was, I believe his loyalty lay with GRU. And after the second assassination attempt of Eduard Shevardnadze, Shevardnadze had Eldar put in prison for complicity in that attempt. Eldar was later let out of prison on a general amnesty and immediately became the chief executive officer of the largest conglomerate inside of Georgia, a company called Kartu. Kartu was ostensibly owned by a guy named Bidzina Ivanishvili, and Bidzina later became the prime minister who was elected and clipped the wings of Misha Saakashvili. Everything that I was able to uncover suggested that Bidzina Ivanishvili didn't own the company, that it was in fact a GRU slush fund derived from their operations in smuggling drugs out of Afghanistan.
That's an amazing story. And as you and I both know, in trying to piece the puzzle together in this kind of event, it can get very gray, and sometimes there's not absolutes in this. But at the end of the day, in 1993, a good man was killed. And what you've done so well, Michael, in putting the spy who was left behind together is connect the dots to the great game of espionage and all the bad that comes out of this kind of business at times, and the death of a CIA officer. So I thank you for doing this story. I think it's a very powerful one. I know that our listeners here at Stratfor will find this fascinating, and we appreciate the work you did for this story and shining a little transparency into the life of a man, and it certainly was a story that needs to be told.
And Fred, I appreciate the work that you and your fellow professionals did for many, many years for the United States, because one of the things I learned from this was the extraordinary professionalism and dedication of the men and women at the pointy end of our spear.
Well, you're very kind to say that. Thank you again, Michael.
You bet.
With Stratfor's Chief Security Officer, Fred Burton, and Michael Pullara, author of The Spy Who Was Left Behind. Russia, the United States, and the true story of the betrayal and assassination of a CIA agent. If you'd like to learn more about the book, you can visit Michael Pullara's author page on simonandschuster.com, and we'll include links to online retailers in the show notes, along with a link to Fred Burton's latest bestseller, Beirut Rules: The Murder of a CIA Station Chief in Hezbollah's War Against America. And if you're interested in learning how Stratfor can help you stay on top of world events, be sure to visit Stratfor Worldview and learn more about individual, team, and enterprise level access at worldview.stratfor.com/subscribe. And you can even register for free limited access to explore more of our work. If you have a question about the podcast or even an idea for the next one, you can email us at podcast@stratfor.com. And if you have a moment, please leave a review on the podcast page on iTunes or wherever you listen. We really appreciate your feedback. And for more geopolitical intelligence, analysis, and forecasting that reveal the underlying significance and future implications of world events, be sure to follow us on Twitter @Stratfor.